Hey everyone, it's Dave and Teddy. Thank you for tuning in as always, and today I figured I'd start off the video by trying to bribe you with Teddy's cuteness to subscribe if you haven't already. Say hi, Teddy. How's it going? All right, now that we've released Teddy back to his usual habitat, I figured today it's really past time that we got caught up on a lot of developments with Rocket Lab stock and the company lately. I know a lot of people out there probably don't have time to sit down and watch a full hour-plus long live stream when it comes to the earnings calls, so I figured today I really should go over the most important points from Rocket Lab's earnings call and their presentation, as well as a bunch of the stuff that's happened since that earnings call, because there has been a lot, and you've probably noticed the stock has actually made a big move. So congratulations to shareholders who have had good returns over the past week or so, and if you're new to Rocket Lab and just hopping aboard, well, welcome to the Rocket Lab Club. Before we do dive into all that good info, I hope you will consider hitting subscribe, as Teddy asked previously, and if you are already a subscriber, those likes and comments always help out as well. With that out of the way, let's dive into this week's Rocket Lab updates. Okay, so starting off with the stock, obviously we had an absolutely wild week, briefly climbing all the way to $7 per share before retracing a little bit, but still closing out the day at around $6.56, which, as you can see, is the highest we've been for quite a while, although we have had a couple of these big jumps over the past year or so while we've still been channel bound. So it remains to be seen if we're kind of establishing a new base here, or if this is just another one of those big sharp moves that could fall back down. Have to see, and I'll give you some more speculation on that a little bit later on. This was driven partly because of the overall markets doing extremely well. The NASDAQ obviously had a great run. We had some favorable macro data when it comes to jobs reports, that sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of companies were up, and strangely enough, a lot of space companies were up as well. Obviously, we've talked previously about the massive run in AST, but, you know, Redwire had a great day, Intuitive Machines, Planet Labs, and a lot of these space companies did pretty well, so not just confined to Rocket Lab, which is interesting because, yeah, they outperformed the overall markets. Maybe it's a small caps thing as well. Another interesting thing that happened after the earnings call and may have contributed to part of the run-up at least is that KeyBank maintained their overweight rating on Rocket Lab and kept their target for $8 per share. And when that news did come out, we did see a little bit of a pop in the stock as well. The other thing that's interesting is Rocket Lab has really climbed the charts lately when it comes to Wall Street bets. Not something we're usually used to around here. So this chart comes from a website that tracks the most mentioned stocks on Wall Street bets. And look at that, number 1 and number 2, AST, Space Mobile, and Rocket Lab. Kind of expected with the kind of run that AST has had that it would draw the attention of a lot of Wall Street bets folks, but I wouldn't have expected Rocket Lab to be way up there in number 2. So we may be getting a lot of new shareholders, a lot of new retail shareholders, that is. The thing that comes into play with these Wall Street bets things is a lot of people do like crazy call option strategies, and they're just in it for the short term as opposed to new long-term shareholders. So, you know, you love to see new long-term retail shareholders come in and do well and hold on to it. We'll see if they pile out just as quickly as they piled in and move on to the next big thing, whatever that may be, on the Wall Street Bets forum. So, a few high-level things from the earnings call, in case you didn't see it. I thought they did a great job of zooming out and just showing the robust backlog they do have for the satellite manufacturing business, showing that they have 18 spacecraft for that SDA constellation they're working on right now, 17 for MDA Globalstar, 3 for Varda with the in-space manufacturing, 2 for NASA Escapade. Those were actually just sent to Blue Origin to be launched on their New Glenn rocket. So Rocket Lab completely done those 2 satellites now. Exciting to see. Great job from the team. We have the Victus Haze mission, the responsive launch mission for the U.S. Air Force, as well as the refueling space depot mission and a Viasat mission, which is one I was actually not as familiar with. And someone like me who follows the company this closely, I think it's great to see all of the different missions mapped out, because sometimes the smaller ones get lost in the shuffle. They did go over the Electron billing model, which is something, a lot of us were already familiar with at a high level, but I guess a lot of the analysts may not have been, because the stock would move a ton when a launch gets delayed, and they really just wanted to emphasize that they get paid most of the money well before the launch. So they've got a schedule of getting paid 10%, then 20, then 30, then 30, and then 10 on launch day. So when one of these launches gets pushed back, only 10% of that revenue remains to be collected. Now, it's not showing up on the income statements because they don't technically recognize the revenue until it's launched, but it's in Rocket Lab's accounts, and then in the accounting numbers, they just show it as recognized when that launch happens, and they've, gotten rid of all obligations for the money. But, it's in Rocket Lab's bank accounts. It's not going back to the customers when these things get delayed, so not the end of the world, and I'm glad they kind of just explained that to some people. I think it really helped out. Obviously, we've seen this chart before, at least a lot of us, showing Electron's fastest to 50 launches out of any commercially developed rocket ever, beating out Falcon 9. We'll see if that'll continue. They say they're on pace to beat out Falcon 9 to 100 launches as well. Yes, it is a smaller rocket, but in some senses, a launch is a launch, and you've still got to do a lot of similar work. Although, not taking away from anything Falcon 9 and SpaceX have accomplished, because it's been absolutely astounding, and they just dominate in terms of the mass to orbit category for the entire world. So great for SpaceX as well. Neutron rocket development timeline, I think, and it's funny because I actually pointed out some similar data to this in a previous video, but yeah, they just wanted to point out how long it took to develop Neutron compared to some other rockets, and that, even though there was a bit of a delay here, it's still really amazing time. They're on track for 4.3 years from the rocket announcement to the first launch. That still beats out Falcon 9, beats New Glenn handily, Vulcan even more handily, and Ariane 6. I mean, it's not even close. So hopefully they don't get delayed anymore, but they're still on track to develop the Neutron faster than SpaceX did the Falcon 9, which I think some people don't realize when they're, seeing Falcon 9 launch regularly, and Neutron is still building out, and they had that, 6-month-ish delay. In terms of revenue and gross margin numbers, they had their first $100 million+ quarter in revenue, which was absolutely amazing to see. Extremely exciting. $106 million in revenue. That's a 15% quarter-on-quarter increase. So going back to the previous quarter, that's 15% growth. But if you look at year over year, so the same quarter last year, that's 71% revenue growth. So that's amazing top-line growth for the company. Yes, last year's revenue growth seemed a little bit light, but this, to me, more than makes up for it. And that compound annual growth rate we're seeing for the overall top line of the company is really hitting what I expected, when I started looking into them a year or two ago. So extremely exciting. Gross margin slightly down due to a slightly weaker mix of things they sold on the space system side of things, but still overall pretty happy with these numbers. In terms of free cash flow and adjusted EBITDA, actually not as bad as I was thinking. So if you look at Q2 2024 versus Q1 of 2024, adjusted EBITDA this quarter not as bad as last quarter at negative 21.2. But really, until they really get Neutron launching, they're just going to be burning money. It's just how rocket programs work. And I feel like it's kind of hiding the performance of the rest of the business and how well it's doing, just because they've got to spend so much money to get Neutron going. But once that gets going and they can kind of taper off the R&D and development money for Neutron, is when the cash flows will really start to shine. And even when Neutron starts contributing money, it'll just be even better. For purchases of property, equipment, and software, we were looking at $15.3 million as they continue to invest. A lot of that, I'm assuming, is for Neutron. And then In terms of operating expenses, one thing I just wanted to point out is that it looks like they did just have their stock-based compensation annual merit cycle, and I did see a jump in shares outstanding, so that's something to keep an eye on. It's a little bit of a dilution event, which is not uncommon for growth companies. Happens to a lot of them as they try to retain great talent by offering stock-based compensation, but to me, the numbers are quite reasonable, and it's not like getting out of hand or anything. In terms of R&D spending, we saw $34.7 million for the quarter and SG&A being $23.8. Now, on to backlog. So this is interesting in how you take it, how you interpret the data. On the one hand, backlog above $1 billion, very healthy, 1.067 billion. And it's nice that the backlog didn't shrink because we've just had a massive growth in the backlog over the past while, especially with the announcement of that SDA deal, which was $500 million. So backlog quarter on quarter increase 5%, which is, you can think of it as they booked 5% more business than they got paid in this quarter, which is good because it's an indication that the growth will continue, but 5% growth, doesn't sound that impressive. But on the other hand, the growth for Rocket Lab in the backlog is very lumpy. They sign these big contracts, then you get very little for a little while, then you get another massive contract that really moves the needle. So not something I'm massively worried about, and at the very least, you can see that they can maintain these revenue rates based on, the amount of new backlog that they had signed this quarter. But it's not an indication that you're going to see massive growth from these levels. Although, come on, guys, we just did have 71%. So it wouldn't shock me to have like a little bit of a, I guess you could call it digestion period at these levels before the next leg of growth really takes off. They have also said that 44% of this backlog is to be recognized within 12 months, while the remaining 56% would be beyond 12 months. So that really gives us a great idea in terms of how much money they're expecting to make over the next 12 months. Although it is possible they sign new contracts and recognize backlog on those contracts as well within the next 12-month period. But just in terms of what they've already booked, we should be able to do the math and find out exactly how much they're expecting to make. Should be something like $450 million, maybe $460. I'll have to do the exact numbers on my spreadsheets. And interestingly enough, in this quarter, most of the backlog growth did come from launch, going from $215 million of backlog to $294, whereas Space Systems, again, I did mention the massive SDA deal. It's kind of slowed down a little bit, but wouldn't shock me to see that pick back up again later in the year. And still, Space Systems, absolutely the beast of the business right now. Now we're heading over to MainstreetData. They do a great job of charting a lot of financial information for companies, and I do have a referral link in the description down below if you're interested in checking out the site. They do have a free version as well, so you don't always have to pay depending on what you want to do. Checking out revenue by segment, this is interesting because it breaks it down between launch and Space Systems. You can really see that Space Systems growth has been amazing and really driving the ship. Great growth in the quarter, and obviously a kind of real step change at the start of the year. So looking very healthy overall in terms of revenue growth. Would like to see launch pick up a bit more though, and I'm sure that will happen down the line. Now, this is the gross profit. Now, it's not net, so don't fool yourself into thinking the company is cash flow positive right now, because they are still burning money to develop Neutron. But in terms of just gross profit on the businesses they're currently running and those operating margins, they now are looking even more healthy with like a $27-ish million figure, I believe. So very good trend for the gross profits. We do eventually expect the business to get closer to 50% as they scale, as Neutron gets going, build out some of those bigger satellite constellations and that sort of thing. Also, I checked the 10Q form that is filed with the SEC. There's a few interesting things in there to talk about. One of them, which I found interesting, was that the cost per launch for the 3 months ending in June 30th, 2024, this past quarter, was $5.4 million versus that same period last year was $7.2 million. So as they scale launch and increase that cadence, they're driving down the cost to them per launch dramatically. Last year, that 7.2 figure, that's pretty much break even, a little bit better than break even, but when they're charging 7.5-ish million to 8 million per launch, and now they're driving down their own cost to 5.4 million, that's pretty good, and that's only with a cadence that we're tracking to, maybe 17 launches this year. We'll have to see how it goes, but once they, get into the 20s, now that's when the cost per launch will get even lower, because a lot of their cost in terms of, the infrastructure, the ground equipment, the launch pad, all that stuff is just fixed, and they pay for it if they have one launch or if they have 50 launches. So the more launches they can have and kind of absorb that fixed cost, the better overall the business looks and the more profitable it is. Obviously, once they get reusability going as well, that will be an even bigger improvement. Another highlight here from the 10Q, I just wanted to point out, they did mention they signed 17 launch contracts year to date. We knew about a lot of these. We found out about a few new ones on the earnings call, and I just wanted to do some quick math and point out that if they sign 17 launch contracts from January 1st to August 8th, which is around when the earnings call was, that is a run rate of about 25 launches being signed in a 12-month period. So if you extrapolate that out, you can imagine they're signing about 25 launches every 12 months, at least right now, which is really perfect because the goal is 22 launches per year. Anything above 20 is, as we saw, the margins improving, and that's the part where you start hitting those really high gross margin numbers for the business. So very encouraging to see that level of new signing for Electron, and hopefully it continues. And yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Very exciting to have the future of Electron look strong and margins continue to improve. And once we get reusability, as I said, should be even better. R&D costs, I just figured it was a little interesting to look at. Obviously, Neutron still a big spend item. We had in the 6-month ending January 30th, so the first half of the year basically of 2024, R&D of $78.5 million versus $54.9 million the previous year. So they've been really ramping up R&D spend when it comes to Neutron and other endeavors, which is kind of why the bottom line still looks pretty much the same, even though they're making more and more money. But as Neutron starts flying, R&D starts to taper off a bit, plus all that money they've invested in R&D starts paying dividends and they get to earn money on Neutron. I think the financials will look a lot better, so probably, hopefully, mid-next year, and then the next few quarters after that is when we start to get really cooking and start to look at profitability for the entire business. Obviously, another big event was the news of the Archimedes engine hot fire. One of the things I think holding back the stock has been risk, and obviously when you're developing a new rocket, there is a lot of risks involved. I personally am very comfortable in where I've placed my bet on this because I think Rocket Lab's team is amazing. They've done it before. Peter Beck is a genius when it comes to rocket engineering. But this event with this hot fire hopefully has removed a lot of risk because propulsion is one of the most challenging pieces, and this hot fire, very good sign for the progress on Neutron. So you'll love to see it, and hopefully we get some more videos in the future. Quick other piece of news is that the SDA awarded 20 satellite builds to a couple companies. Now, a few of us were hoping Rocket Lab might win the contract for some of these. Ultimately, it didn't happen. This was won by York Space Systems and Terran Orbital, which was interesting because Terran Orbital just got taken over by Lockheed and they're about to go bankrupt. So interesting choice there. But yeah, unfortunately for Rocket Lab, they didn't get this round, but they still do have quite a healthy backlog when it comes to satellites. Now, there were also some interesting pieces of news from some interviews that Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck and CFO Adam Spice did. You may have seen them. I actually did interview them myself, along with Matt Money, Vince S. Bullish, and Scott O. We got some great information on them. We learned from one of Matt's questions that was extremely interesting is that HASTE will launch from other launch pads around the world. And he said pads plural, so that makes me think more than even 2 launch pads. These haste missions could be 3 launch pads at some point, which I was absolutely shocked that they just revealed that. I thought they might say, oh, we'll look into it, we're not sure yet or whatever, but yeah, no, it will. So maybe the other coast of the US, maybe Australia, maybe they'll launch haste from New Zealand. Let me know what you think down below. I found that absolutely fascinating and a very good sign for the demand for haste, because they've said previously they're not willing to pay for launch pads unless there's a significant amount of launches, because those launch pads are just a fixed cost that can eat into things unless they're bringing new launches with them that you couldn't have had at your existing pads. So very interesting piece of news there. We got a lot of good financial information on Scott O's section if you want to check it out. Some more granular breakdown on how much they're making on the component side of space systems versus building out full satellites and full satellite buses. So that granularity is really interesting to see, as well as some information on tax breaks and awards they're getting from the CHIPS Act and the government to expand their Solero business, as well as some discussion about Neutron's first launch, how that will go, and how, you know, they're not going to try and recover that one. They'll do a soft landing in the ocean because they don't want to risk blowing up a landing barge. So there was definitely a lot of interesting stuff there, and I encourage you to check out those interviews if you haven't already, although I have to assume a lot of you have already seen them. Now, before we wrap up, just some wild speculation on the stock price, where it may go, what's been going on. As I said previously, there was a little bit of a Wall Street bets mania going on, massive pop in the stock. Where is this going to go? Well, hard to say, but if you ask me, and I guess you are because you're on this channel, I'm not completely convinced that this is it in terms of never going back down. Now, I hope it is it, because I have a very good sized position in Rocket Lab, but if you saw the chart that I showed previously, and maybe I'll even try to pop it up on the screen here, this is like the 3rd time we've had one of these jump ups in the same range, and then it eventually drops back down to the 4s before jumping up again. And my thoughts around this are, okay, we've got a lot of excitement from Wall Street bets. Those people, from what I understand, usually jump in of and out of stocks and make big moves over the short term, but are not generally long-term investors. The earnings were very good, so maybe that's a sign that we can kind of sustain this level. But if you look at the bottom line as opposed to the top line, the profitability numbers, again, as I've said many times, and the management has said, will not really get better until Neutron starts launching because it's just so expensive. So I've thought for a while that when we get a new base and things really take off is when Neutron starts to launch, it starts contributing revenue to the top line, and not only that, the R&D spend on Neutron, which is massive, starts to taper off, get less and less. So that means the top line gets a big boost, the bottom line gets a lot better in terms of percentages. They eventually go cash flow positive, and at that point they have a real price to earnings where analysts can say, oh look, this price to earnings is 20, that's reasonable. And you know, a lot of the more risk-off investors can pile in because they see it's a profitable company. So I tend to think next year is like the big rocket ship event. I hope I'm wrong. You know, maybe I am. Maybe we've shown enough progress on Neutron and Archimedes and the top-line growth in the company that people will realize what's going on here. But, you know, wouldn't shock me. I was here when we jumped up to 8 previously and fell back down. I held through it all. I'm sure a lot of you did as well. Let me know what you guys think. Again, I do hope I'm wrong on that, but it just seems like it's possible, especially given the whole Wall Street bets piece of the equation. You know, maybe macro markets carry it, though, and interest rates start to drop, small caps, you know, companies that are not yet profitable start to do better again. Could be we get a steady increase leading up to that Neutron launch. So hope I'm not the bearer of bad news. Let me know how you guys think the stock is going to go over the next while. Did you make any trades? I saw some people selling covered calls and getting some juicy premiums. I found that interesting, although I didn't do any of that myself. And what piece of news from the earnings or from the interviews did you think was the most interesting, the most important, or perhaps the most overlooked? I will check out your answers in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. I do appreciate it. I hope you have a great day and a great rest of the week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.